There was a time when turning on the television meant a decent chance of seeing a man hang upside down from a helicopter, walk across the surface of a swimming pool, or bury himself alive beneath a city sidewalk. For the better part of a decade, that man was everywhere. He was the face of a new kind of magic, one that traded top hats and rabbits for leather jackets, tattoos, and a look in his eyes that made audiences wonder if what they were watching was really a trick at all. Then, almost as quickly as he arrived, he seemed to vanish. No dramatic goodbye, no final bow under the lights. Just a slow fade from the cultural conversation. So what actually happened to Criss Angel? The answer isn't a scandal or a single dramatic event. It's a much longer story about grief, reinvention, fatherhood, and a man who kept choosing to disappear from the spotlight on his own terms, again and again, for reasons far more human than anyone watching at home ever realized. Long before the leather and eyeliner, before Las Vegas marquees carried his name in enormous letters, he was just Christopher Nicholas Sarantakos, a boy growing up in East Meadow, New York. Born in December of 1967, he was the middle child of 3 brothers in a Greek-American household built on hard work and close family ties. His father ran a donut shop and kept long hours, but he never missed the moments that mattered to his sons. That mix of discipline and devotion left a mark on young Christopher that would follow him for the rest of his life. The spark came early. At 6 years old, an aunt showed him a simple card trick, and something in him just clicked. It wasn't the kind of passing fascination most kids grow out of. He started spending his afternoons buried in library books about magic and Houdini, practicing sleight of hand until his fingers ached, and staging makeshift shows in his living room for anyone who would sit still long enough to watch. By the time he was 12, he'd landed his first paid gig at a birthday party, walking away with $10, and, more importantly, the sense that this could be more than a hobby. From there, he chased every stage he could find, diners, nightclubs, community centers, anywhere that would let a determined teenager show off card tricks and escapes. It's worth noting how ordinary his beginnings actually were. There was no wealthy backer, no television deal waiting in the wings, no instant discovery. Just a kid with an obsession, working small rooms for small crowds, sharpening a craft that most people around him probably assumed would fade with age. It didn't. Just as his career started to gain real traction, the Sarantakos family was hit with devastating news. His father was diagnosed with stomach cancer, and doctors gave him only a matter of weeks. Instead, he fought for more than 3 years, and throughout that entire fight, Christopher stayed close, refusing to look away from what his father was going through. He later said that watching his father battle illness taught him something he carried into every performance afterward. The belief that the mind has extraordinary power over the body, and that willpower can push a person further than seems physically possible. In 1998, his father died in his arms. It's the kind of loss that reorders a person's priorities overnight, and by his own account, that's exactly what it did. He has said publicly that the moment fundamentally changed him, pushing him to confront his own fears head-on rather than simply perform tricks that looked impressive. From that point forward, the stunts he built his career on weren't just spectacle for spectacle's sake. Hanging from a helicopter with hooks through his skin, submitting himself to pain most people would go out of their way to avoid. These were, in his own framing, acts of tribute, ways of proving to himself that he could survive what frightened him most, in honor of a father who had done the same. This is the part of his story that rarely made it into magazine profiles or late-night interview segments. Underneath the persona, the dramatic music, the intense stare into the camera, the whispered narration about defying death, was a grieving son who had turned his mourning into a mission. He wasn't performing to shock people for the sake of ratings. He was working through something, in public, night after night. What eventually became a globally recognized brand did not happen quickly. He spent roughly a decade and a half grinding through small venues, working other jobs to make ends meet, and refining a style that deliberately avoided imitating any of the magicians who came before him. He's talked about staying away from other performers in the industry specifically so he wouldn't absorb their habits or their rhythms. He wanted something that felt entirely his own, built from scratch rather than borrowed from tradition. That approach eventually led him to blend magic with heavy metal music and a rock and roll stage presence, an unusual pairing at the time that set him apart from the typical Vegas illusionist image. In 1995, he formed a band that fused those two worlds together, and a few years later released an album built around that same concept, magic and music as two expressions of the same creative impulse. By his early 20s, he had relocated to New York City and was performing constantly, building a local reputation one show at a time. That grind eventually carried him to bigger rooms, including performances at Madison Square Garden and marathon stretches where he'd perform dozens of shows in a single day at industry conventions, simply to get in front of as many people as possible. Throughout all of it, his mother remained one of his steadiest supporters, showing up to shows and helping manage the logistics of a career that was still, at that point, far from guaranteed to succeed. It's a detail that tends to get lost in the retelling of his story, but by his own account, her presence mattered enormously during the years when almost nothing about his future was certain. Everything shifted in the summer of 2005, when a new television show premiered that didn't look like anything magic audiences had seen before. It combined classic illusion with genuinely dangerous stunts, cinematic production values, and an intensity that felt more like a rock concert than a magic act. The first season alone delivered over a dozen episodes built around jaw-dropping moments, a helicopter suspension using hooks through the skin, a levitation performed between two buildings high above a city street, and other stunts designed to make viewers question whether what they were watching could possibly be a trick. As the show continued across multiple seasons, the stakes kept rising. He walked across the surface of a swimming pool. He lay on broken glass while a steamroller passed over his body. He escaped from a block of cement submerged underwater. Each new season pushed further into territory that felt genuinely risky, and that risk was precisely what set the show apart from anything competing for the same audience. Over 6 seasons and nearly 100 episodes, the series became appointment television for millions of viewers and turned him into one of the most recognizable performers in the country. That success came at a real physical cost. Years of extreme stunts left him with a long list of injuries, and the toll on his body was something he rarely downplayed in later interviews. He also faced criticism from within the magic community itself, where some practitioners felt his emphasis on danger and spectacle came at the expense of traditional craftsmanship. He never fully agreed with that critique. His position was consistent. Magic had to evolve to stay relevant, and reaching new audiences sometimes meant breaking away from the conventions that had defined the art form for generations. Given the scale of the show's success, it's hard to argue he was wrong. By 2010, after 6 seasons of pushing his body to its limits on television, he made the decision to step away from the show, not because it was canceled and not because of any controversy, but because he wanted to pursue something bigger. That next chapter was a partnership with one of the most respected names in live entertainment, bringing his reality-bending illusions to a custom-built show at a major Las Vegas resort. The first version of that show, which debuted in 2008 under the partnership, did not land the way anyone had hoped. Critics were unimpressed. Audiences left confused rather than amazed, and what was supposed to be a triumphant Vegas debut instead became an early lesson in how badly things can go even for an established performer. Rather than walking away, he took back creative control of the production and rebuilt it from the ground up. By 2013, that reworked show had become a completely different experience. A high-energy production built specifically for the stage, packed with new illusions designed to work in a live theater setting rather than a television studio. It succeeded where the earlier version had failed, running for years and filling seats night after night in one of the most competitive entertainment markets in the world. It's a detail worth sitting with. One of the most famous magicians in the world had a very public flop in Las Vegas, and instead of quietly disappearing, he rebuilt the entire show and turned it into a long-running hit. That kind of resilience doesn't usually make for dramatic headlines, but it says a lot about how he actually operates behind the scenes. In 2015, while his Las Vegas show was thriving, he and his family received the kind of news that puts an entire career into perspective. His young son was diagnosed with an aggressive form of leukemia at just 20 months old. The child went into remission for roughly a year before doctors discovered the cancer had returned, presenting in a way that required a difficult and frightening course of treatment. For a performer whose entire public identity had been built around conquering fear and defying physical limits, this was a different category of challenge entirely, one he couldn't outstunt his way through. By his own account, he stepped back from performing, canceled scheduled appearances, and spent his time in hospital rooms with his son rather than on stage. He has described that period as the darkest and most difficult stretch of his life, filled with a kind of helplessness that no amount of showmanship could fix. Rather than retreating from public life entirely, he redirected his platform toward a cause he suddenly understood on a deeply personal level. Discovering how underfunded childhood cancer research actually was, he established a foundation dedicated to supporting affected families and funding research into pediatric cancer treatment. He organized telethon-style fundraising events, bringing together performers and public figures to raise money and awareness for a cause that had, until that point, existed on the margins of his career rather than at its center. Even during performances, he began incorporating his son's story into his shows, using his stage time to talk openly about what his family was going through rather than keeping it separate from his public persona. Rather than pausing his Las Vegas production entirely during this period, he folded his personal experience directly into it. The show, which had moved to a new venue, took on a noticeably different emotional register. It was still built around large-scale illusions and dramatic staging, but audiences and critics alike noticed a shift, a sense that the performance now carried real weight behind it, rather than existing purely as spectacle. He's spoken about this shift in interviews, describing how his son's illness changed the way he approached performing altogether. What had once been primarily about generating shock and amazement became something closer to a coping mechanism, a nightly ritual that helped him hold onto some sense of stability during an otherwise chaotic and frightening period. Audiences responded to that shift, and the outpouring of support from fans, letters, donations, public messages of encouragement became, by his own description, a genuine source of strength for his family during the hardest stretch of treatment. Over time, his son's condition improved, and the family found moments of real relief amid the uncertainty, though the experience left a permanent mark on how he talks about his work. It would be incomplete to tell this story without acknowledging the persona itself, because so much of the public fascination with him was built around exactly that. From the beginning of his career, he leaned into a dark Gothic aesthetic that set him apart from the traditional image of a stage magician: the all-black wardrobe, the heavy eyeliner, the deliberately mysterious symbol he used as a personal logo. That aesthetic invited speculation. Fans and casual viewers alike wondered aloud whether there was something more than performance behind the persona, whether the darkness was purely stylistic or hinted at something else entirely. He never seemed particularly bothered by that speculation. If anything, he let the ambiguity work in his favor, understanding that mystery was part of what made the character compelling to watch. But he's also been fairly direct, when asked plainly, that the entire act is built on craft, misdirection, physical conditioning, and relentless rehearsal rather than anything supernatural. The theatrics were always a costume. The skill underneath them was real. So why don't we see him the way we used to? The honest answer isn't dramatic. There was no cancellation, no falling out, no career-ending scandal. What actually happened is that his priorities shifted more than once in response to real events in his life. He stepped away from network television on his own terms to chase a bigger creative challenge in Las Vegas. He absorbed a very public failure and quietly rebuilt rather than walking away. And when his son's health became the most urgent thing in his life, he scaled back the public-facing side of his career to be present for his family, redirecting his platform toward a cause that mattered more to him than ratings ever had. None of that fits neatly into the kind of headline that generates clicks, which is probably part of why the real story rarely gets told in full. The truth is simpler and, in a lot of ways, more admirable than any rumor about a dramatic disappearance. A performer who built an entire career on convincing audiences that the impossible was achievable spent his off-stage years proving something quieter, but arguably more difficult: that a person can absorb real loss, real failure, and real fear for their child, and keep choosing to show up for the people who matter most, even when no one's watching. That more than any levitation or underwater escape might be the most convincing trick he ever pulled off.